The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before clicking to voicemail again. Christopher Holland's hands trembled as he pressed redial for the 15th time, his voice cracking as he left another desperate message. Tamika, please, just tell me what I did wrong. Emma keeps asking where you are, and I don't know what to say. I can't breathe without you here. He'd discovered her empty room at dawn, every trace of her presence erased as if she'd never existed. Her key lay on the pristine marble countertop, beside a formal resignation letter, so cold it couldn't possibly have come from the same hands that had traced his face with such tenderness just 48 hours ago. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the hallway, mocking him with memories of whispered promises and passionate surrenders that now felt like cruel lies. Hello once again, my beautiful Royal Story family. I'm curious, where in this beautiful world are you watching from today? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet village, drop your location in the comments below. Christopher Holland's life operated with the precision of the technology empire he'd built from nothing. But success meant nothing when measured against the gaping hole where his heart used to be. 3 years had passed since cancer stole his wife Sarah, and Christopher had perfected the art of existing without truly living. His days began at 5 a.m. with punishing workouts that exhausted his body but never quieted his mind. His penthouse home in Manhattan's Upper East Side remained a shrine to careful control, every surface gleaming, every corner free of the chaos that came with genuine emotion. The 30-floor high-rise offered breathtaking views of Central Park, but Christopher rarely noticed the changing seasons beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows. Marble floors echoed his footsteps through rooms designed by the city's most exclusive interior designer, yet the space felt hollow despite its perfection. Custom suits lined his walk-in closet, each one armor against a world that had already dealt him its worst blow. 6-year-old Emma moved through this controlled environment like a ghost of her former self. Where once she'd filled rooms with laughter and demanded piggyback rides, now she spoke in whispers and sought comfort from Mrs. Chen, the elderly housekeeper, rather than her father. Christopher provided everything money could buy, the finest clothes, the best tutors, exclusive private school, but somehow couldn't bridge the emotional chasm that loss had carved between them. The morning everything changed began like every other. Christopher sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing quarterly reports while Emma ate breakfast in silence 20 feet away. The distance between them might as well have been 20 miles. She picked at her scrambled eggs, stealing glances at her father's rigid posture, while he pretended not to notice her obvious longing for connection. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft classical music that filled the dining room. "Mrs. Chen says I need a new nanny because I'm getting too old for her to keep up with." Christopher's fingers paused over his laptop keyboard. Emma had cycled through 4 nannies in 2 years, each one leaving with carefully worded resignation letters that diplomatically avoided mentioning his emotional unavailability as the core problem. Professional women who came highly recommended, with impeccable credentials and sterling references, somehow couldn't penetrate the wall of grief that surrounded the Holland household. "I've scheduled interviews for this afternoon," he replied without looking up from his screen. "The agency is sending their 3 best candidates." Emma nodded solemnly, her small shoulders carrying the weight of premature wisdom that came from too much loss too young. At 6, she'd learned to expect disappointment, to guard her heart against caring too much about the adults who drifted in and out of her life. Her mother's death had taught her that love meant inevitable abandonment, and her father's emotional absence had reinforced that painful lesson daily. The first 2 candidates that afternoon fit Christopher's expectations perfectly. Stern-faced women in their 50s with impressive resumes and no-nonsense attitudes toward child-rearing. They spoke about structured learning environments and disciplinary frameworks, viewing Emma as a project to be managed rather than a child to be nurtured. Christopher appreciated their professionalism, even as something deep in his chest tightened at their clinical approach to his daughter's care. Then Tamika Wood walked into his office, and everything Christopher thought he knew about control shattered like expensive crystal hitting marble floors. She was 27, with smooth, dark skin that seemed to glow with inner warmth and confidence that filled the room before she'd spoken a word. Her curves were impossible to ignore, even dressed professionally in a navy blazer and pencil skirt that somehow managed to be both appropriate and devastatingly attractive. Natural hair framed her face in soft curls that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through his office windows, and when she smiled, Christopher felt something stir in his chest that he'd assumed had died with Sarah. "Mr. Holland," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that lasted just a moment longer than necessary. "I'm Tamika Wood. Thank you for considering me for Emma's care." Her voice carried warmth that seemed to wrap around his name, making it sound less like a business formality and more like an invitation. Christopher found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way her lips curved naturally upward, as if smiling was her default expression. When he realized he'd been staring, heat crept up his neck beneath his perfectly knotted tie. "Please, have a seat," he managed, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "I've reviewed your credentials. Master's degree in child development, 5 years of private nanny experience, excellent references." "Thank you," Tamika replied, settling into the chair with graceful confidence. "But I imagine you're more interested in how I connect with children than what my diploma says." There was something in her tone, not challenging exactly, but not deferential either. She met his gaze directly, unfazed by his wealth or the intimidating scope of his office with its wall of awards and certificates. Most employees, even highly qualified ones, displayed some nervousness in his presence. Tamika Wood looked at him like she was measuring him, not the other way around. "Emma has had several nannies," Christopher said carefully. "She's been through significant trauma, and she requires someone who understands the complexities of grief in children." "Losing a parent isn't something you get over, Mr. Holland," Tamika replied, her voice softer now but no less direct. "It's something you learn to carry. The question is whether the adults in a child's life help them carry it with love or leave them to struggle alone." Something in her words hit him like a physical blow. Christopher's hands tightened on his desk blotter, his carefully constructed professional demeanor cracking slightly. "And you think you understand what my daughter needs?" "I think she needs someone who sees her as more than a problem to be solved," Tamika answered, leaning forward slightly. "Children don't heal from loss by being managed, Mr. Holland. They heal by being loved unconditionally and given permission to feel their emotions instead of hiding them." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond professional childcare. Christopher felt exposed, as if this woman could see through the walls he'd built around his heart and his home. The sensation was terrifying and somehow exhilarating. "Would you like to meet Emma?" he heard himself asking, though he'd intended to end the interview with the same polite dismissal he'd given the other candidates. Tamika's smile brightened, transforming her entire face. "I'd love to." They found Emma in the living room, curled in a corner of the massive sectional sofa with a book she was pretending to read. She looked up as they entered, her expression shifting to the carefully neutral mask she wore around new adults. Christopher watched from the doorway as Tamika approached his daughter, noting how she moved with natural grace, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. Instead of standing over Emma or taking a seat at the opposite end of the sofa, Tamika knelt on the floor beside the coffee table, bringing herself to the child's eye level. The gesture was simple, but it immediately changed the dynamic in the room. "Hi, Emma," Tamika said, her voice warm but not artificially sweet. "I'm Tamika. That looks like an interesting book. What's it about?" Emma glanced at her father, seeking permission, or perhaps wondering if this was another adult who would disappear from her life before she could risk caring. When she looked back at Tamika, something in the woman's patient smile seemed to ease her guardedness. "It's about a girl who finds a secret garden," Emma said quietly. "Everything was dead, but she made it beautiful again." "That's a wonderful story," Tamika replied, settling more comfortably on the floor. I love stories about bringing dead things back to life. Do you think the girl was scared when she first found the garden? Emma considered this, her small fingers playing with the book's cover. Maybe. Dead things can be scary, but maybe she was brave. Maybe she was both, Tamika suggested. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is tend to something that looks hopeless, even when we're scared it might never grow. Christopher felt something tighten in his chest as he watched this exchange. There was a subtext to their conversation that seemed to acknowledge Emma's loss without forcing her to discuss it directly. Tamika spoke to his daughter like she was a complete person with valid thoughts and feelings, not a broken child who needed to be fixed. As the conversation continued, Christopher found himself studying Tamika's profile, noting the gentle curve of her neck and the way afternoon light caught the golden undertones in her skin. When she laughed at something Emma said, the sound was rich and genuine, filling the usually quiet living room with a warmth he'd forgotten could exist in this space. "Mr. Holland," Emma said suddenly, using the formal address she'd adopted since her mother's death, "can Miss Tamika read to me sometime?" The simple request hit Christopher like a revelation. Emma hadn't asked for anything, truly asked, with hope in her voice. In over a year, she'd learned to expect disappointment, to accept whatever decisions adults made on her behalf, without expressing preferences that might lead to heartbreak. But something about Tamika had awakened enough trust for Emma to voice a want. "That would be up to Miss Wood," Christopher replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "If she decides to work with us." Tamika looked up at him from her position on the floor, and their eyes met across the room with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I'd love to read with you, Emma," she said, her gaze never leaving Christopher's face. "I think this could be the beginning of something beautiful." The double meaning in her words wasn't lost on him. Christopher felt heat pool low in his stomach, an unwelcome reminder that he was still a man with needs and desires he'd buried under layers of grief and guilt. The attraction was immediate, undeniable, and completely inappropriate given the professional nature of their relationship. "When could you start?" he heard himself asking, though every rational part of his mind screamed warnings about the danger this woman represented to his carefully controlled existence. "Tomorrow, if you'd like," Tamika replied, finally looking away to smile at Emma. "We have a lot of gardens to tend to, don't we?" Emma actually giggled, a sound Christopher hadn't heard in so long he'd forgotten how it could light up her entire face. In that moment, he knew he was going to hire Tamika Wood. Despite every instinct that warned him she was going to complicate his life in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. That evening, after Tamika had left with promises to return the next morning, Christopher found himself standing in his home office, staring out at the city lights while trying to process what had happened. The interview had lasted 2 hours, far longer than he'd intended, and ended with Emma begging him to hire the nice lady who knows about gardens. But it wasn't just Emma's enthusiasm that had sealed his decision. It was the way Tamika had looked at him during those final moments, as if she could see past his expensive suits and professional success to the man who'd been drowning in grief for 3 years. There had been recognition in her eyes, an understanding that suggested she knew what it felt like to tend to dead things and hope they might bloom again. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as Christopher poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and tried to calm the restless energy thrumming through his body, he found himself anticipating tomorrow in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything since Sarah's death. He had no idea that hiring Tamika Wood would be the decision that finally brought him back to life, or that falling in love with her would nearly destroy everything he'd fought to rebuild. Tamika arrived the next morning, dressed in jeans and a soft sweater that hugged her curves in ways that made Christopher's mouth go dry. She'd traded her professional attire for something more suitable for playing with a 6-year-old, but the casual clothes only served to highlight her natural beauty and the confidence with which she moved through the world. "Good morning, Mr. Holland," she said, setting her purse on the foyer table with the ease of someone who belonged in the space. "I hope you don't mind that I brought some supplies. Emma and I have serious gardening work to do." She held up a canvas bag filled with art supplies, children's books, and what looked like packets of flower seeds. The sight of her domestic preparations in his sterile penthouse felt like watching color bleed into a black and white photograph. "Miss Tamika?" Emma's voice rang out from the top of the stairs, followed by the thunder of small feet racing down marble steps. She launched herself at Tamika with an enthusiasm that made Christopher's chest tighten with emotions he wasn't ready to name. "Good morning, sunshine," Tamika said, catching Emma in a hug that looked completely natural. "Are you ready to start our adventure?" As Christopher watched them together, he realized he was witnessing something he'd thought Emma had lost forever: the ability to be genuinely excited about the future. His daughter glowed under Tamika's attention, chattering about the books she wanted to share and the imaginary garden they were going to create together. The first week established a routine that transformed the entire atmosphere of the Holland household. Tamika arrived each morning at 7:30, staying until Christopher returned from work around 6. During those hours, the penthouse filled with sounds it hadn't held since Sarah's death. Laughter, music, the happy chatter of a child who finally felt heard and valued. Tamika approached Emma's care with the expertise of her education, combined with an intuitive understanding of what a grieving child needed. She didn't try to replace Emma's memories of her mother or push her to move on. Instead, she created space for Emma to talk about Sarah when she wanted to, cry when she needed to, and slowly begin building new sources of joy without guilt. They planted herb gardens in small pots on the kitchen windowsill, transforming the sterile space into something that smelled like basil and hope. Tamika taught Emma to cook simple meals, their afternoon baking sessions filling the penthouse with the warm scents of cookies and muffins. She helped with homework in ways that made learning feel like play, and read bedtime stories with different voices for each character that sent Emma into fits of giggles. But it was the changes in Christopher that were most profound. Even though he fought them every step of the way, he found himself coming home earlier, drawn by the sounds of life emanating from his previously silent penthouse. He'd stand in the doorway of whatever room Tamika and Emma were occupying, watching interactions that revealed a side of his daughter he'd forgotten existed. Emma was funny, it turned out, with a wit that reminded him painfully of Sarah, and an imagination that bloomed under Tamika's encouragement. And Tamika herself was a constant, bewildering presence that challenged everything about his carefully ordered existence. She moved through his home with natural ease, somehow making the expensive designer furniture look comfortable and lived in. She filled vases with grocery store flowers that cost $20 instead of the $200 arrangements his housekeeper usually ordered. And the simple blooms brought more warmth to the space than all his carefully curated art. She also wasn't afraid of him, which proved both refreshing and intensely frustrating. "Emma needs more time outside," she told him one evening after his daughter had gone to bed. They were standing in his kitchen, where she was cleaning up from an art project that had apparently involved glitter and finger paints. "She's been cooped up in this beautiful cage for too long." Christopher looked up from his laptop, where he'd been pretending to work, while actually watching her move around his kitchen like she owned it. "I beg your pardon?" "This penthouse is gorgeous," Tamika continued, wiping glitter from the marble countertop with efficiency that suggested she dealt with bigger messes than this. "But it's 30 floors above the real world. Emma needs dirt under her fingernails and scraped knees and the chance to run until she's breathless." "She has everything she needs here," Christopher replied, his voice cooler than he'd intended. "The building has a gym, a pool, a private playground on the roof deck." Tamika turned to face him fully, and Christopher was struck again by how her presence seemed to fill whatever space she occupied. Even in his enormous kitchen, with its soaring ceilings and open floor plan, she commanded attention simply by existing. "Those are facilities," she said, her tone gentle but unwavering. "Emma needs experiences. She needs to feed ducks in Central Park and get ice cream from street vendors and ride the subway with other kids who laugh too loud. She needs to remember that the world is bigger than grief and loss." Her words hit him like physical blows, each one targeting wounds he'd thought were well hidden beneath expensive suits and professional success. "You think I don't know what my daughter needs? I think you're so afraid of losing her that you've forgotten she's already disappearing." Tamika replied, stepping closer to him. "When was the last time you saw her really smile? Not the polite expression she wears to make adults feel better, but genuine joy?" Christopher's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Anger and something else, something that felt dangerously like attraction, warring in his chest. "You've been here 1 week, and you think you understand our situation." "I understand that you're both drowning," Tamika said, her voice softening with compassion that somehow made her words cut deeper. "And I understand that you're so busy trying to control everything that you can't see the life preservers floating all around you." They were standing closer now, close enough that Christopher could smell her perfume and see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. Close enough that the urge to either kiss her or order her to leave his house was making his heart race in ways that had nothing to do with anger. "Emma is my daughter," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll decide what she needs." "Yes, you will," Tamika agreed, not backing down despite the edge in his tone. "But I hope you'll decide she needs a father who's present for her life, not just paying for it." Before Christopher could respond, she'd stepped back, creating distance that somehow felt like abandonment. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Holland. Sleep well." She gathered her things and left him standing in his kitchen, surrounded by the lingering scents of finger paints and vanilla perfume, his body humming with frustration and desire he had no right to feel. That night, Christopher lay awake replaying every word of their conversation, every moment when her eyes had challenged him to be better than the man he'd become. She was right about Emma. He could see that now, though admitting it felt like acknowledging his failure as a father. But she was also dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with her opinions about parenting. Tamika Wood saw him too clearly, spoke to him too directly, and awakened needs he'd been successfully ignoring for 3 years. The professional boundaries he'd insisted on were already blurring, and Christopher found himself both terrified of where that might lead and unable to imagine his life without her challenging presence. The next morning, she arrived with Emma's jacket and a plan to spend the afternoon in Central Park. When she looked at him with those knowing eyes and asked if he'd like to join them, Christopher heard himself saying yes before his rational mind could intervene. Watching Emma chase pigeons, while Tamika laughed at her daughter's uninhibited joy, Christopher realized he was in trouble far deeper than he'd initially understood. The attraction he'd been fighting was evolving into something more dangerous, genuine affection for a woman who was bringing his family back to life, one smile at a time. He just had no idea how much more complicated things were about to become. The shift in their dynamic became undeniable over the following weeks. What had started as professional disagreements evolved into something far more dangerous, genuine intimacy disguised as concern for Emma's well-being. Christopher found himself manufacturing reasons to come home early, drawn by the sounds of life that now filled his penthouse like music he'd forgotten how to hear. Tamika had transformed not just Emma's world, but the very atmosphere of their home. Gone were the oppressive silences and careful tiptoeing around grief. In their place was the easy rhythm of daily life, lived with purpose and joy. Emma chattered constantly now, her personality blooming under Tamika's patient attention like flowers finally receiving sunlight after a long winter. But it was the way Tamika looked at him that made Christopher's chest tight with emotions he wasn't ready to name. There was no pity in her gaze when she caught him watching them together, no judgment about his previous failures as a father. Instead, there was invitation, a gentle challenge that suggested she could see the man he'd been before grief hollowed him out, and believe that man might still exist beneath the expensive armor he wore. 3 weeks into her employment, their carefully maintained professional distance cracked during what should have been a routine disagreement about Emma's bedtime routine. "She's been having nightmares again," Tamika told him as they stood in his home office, where he'd retreated after dinner to avoid the domestic intimacy of family time. Emma was supposedly asleep, but her restless crying had echoed through the penthouse walls for the past hour. Christopher looked up from financial reports he'd been pretending to review while actually listening to his daughter's distress. "She'll settle down eventually. She always does." "Will she?" Tamika challenged, moving closer to his desk with the fluid confidence that never failed to make his pulse quicken. "Or will she just exhaust herself crying alone until she gives up hope that anyone will come?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow, mainly because he recognized the truth in it. Sarah had always been the one to comfort Emma during nightmares, singing lullabies and telling stories until their daughter felt safe enough to sleep. After Sarah's death, Christopher had tried a few times, but his awkward attempts at comfort seemed to make Emma more upset, not less. Eventually, he'd convinced himself that leaving her to work through the fear alone was building character rather than abandoning her to trauma. "I don't know how to help her," he admitted, the words scraping his throat like broken glass. "Every time I try, I make it worse." Something in his voice must have reached Tamika because her expression softened from challenge to compassion. She moved around his desk, closing the distance between them until she was standing close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something warm and floral that seemed to wrap around his senses like an embrace. "She doesn't need you to fix the nightmares," Tamika said gently. "She just needs to know she's not facing them alone." Before Christopher could respond, Emma's crying intensified, her small voice calling out for her mother in the heartbroken way that never failed to shatter what was left of his composure. Without thinking, he pushed back from his desk, the sound of his daughter's pain finally overriding his fear of inadequacy. They reached Emma's bedroom at the same time, both drawn by the same protective instinct. Christopher hesitated in the doorway, watching Tamika approach the bed where Emma thrashed in the grip of whatever nightmare held her. In the soft glow of the nightlight, his daughter looked impossibly small and vulnerable, her tear-streaked face twisted with the kind of anguish no child should have to carry. "Hey, sunshine," Tamika whispered, settling on the edge of Emma's bed with the natural ease of someone who understood that children needed physical comfort as much as words. "You're safe. Everything's okay." Emma's eyes flew open, wild with terror before focusing on Tamika's familiar face. "Miss Tamika? I dreamed that you went away too. Just like Mommy." The words hit Christopher like bullets, each one finding its mark in the guilt he carried about failing to protect his daughter from loss. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching Tamika gather Emma into her arms with the kind of instinctive tenderness that seemed as natural as breathing. "I'm not going anywhere," Tamika murmured, stroking Emma's hair while his daughter clung to her like a lifeline. "I'm right here, and I'm going to stay right here until you feel safe again." "Promise?" Emma whispered, her voice muffled against Tamika's shoulder. "I promise," Tamika replied, and Christopher heard the depth of commitment in those two words that went far beyond professional obligation. As he watched them together, something cracked open in Christopher's chest, something that had been sealed tight since the day Sarah died. Emma's trust in Tamika was absolute, the kind of faith children offered so rarely and so completely. And Tamika held that trust like the precious gift it was, surrounding Emma with patience and love that asked for nothing in return. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was tiny in the darkness, and Christopher realized she'd noticed him standing in the doorway. "Will you stay too?" The request was so simple, so achingly normal, and yet it terrified him more than any hostile corporate takeover or high-stakes negotiation ever had. But with Tamika's encouraging gaze on him and Emma's hopeful expression cutting through his defenses, Christopher found himself moving toward the bed instead of fleeing to the safety of his office. He sat on Emma's other side, his movements awkward with disuse, and felt his breath catch when his daughter immediately curled against him with the same trusting abandon she'd shown Tamika. Her small body was warm and solid against his chest, a reminder of the miracle he'd helped create and had been too afraid to fully embrace. "Tell me about the dream," he said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. Emma's story tumbled out in the halting way of childhood fears. Monsters that looked like doctors, empty houses where mothers disappeared, and the terrible certainty that everyone she loved would eventually vanish. As she spoke, Christopher felt each word settle into his bones like stones, the weight of his daughter's trauma finally fully registering. "Dreams can't hurt you," he found himself saying, words that Sarah used to whisper during Emma's toddler nightmares. "But even when they feel scary, Daddy's here, and Miss Tamika's here, and you're safe." "You won't go away?" Emma asked, and Christopher heard the fragility beneath her question, the fear that had been growing in silence while he buried himself in work and grief. "Never," he whispered, and meant it with every cell in his body. "I'm sorry I've been so far away, baby girl. That's going to change." Emma's breathing gradually slowed as they sat together in the soft glow of her nightlight, her small body relaxing into the safety of being held by two adults who'd finally shown up for her completely. Tamika began humming something soft and wordless, a melody that seemed to wrap around all three of them like a lullaby made of peace. Christopher found himself studying Tamika's profile in the dim light, noting the way her features softened with tenderness as she gazed down at Emma. There was something almost otherworldly about her in that moment, a kind of elemental nurturing that seemed to emanate from her very core. She belonged in this space, he realized with a jolt that had nothing to do with her professional qualifications and everything to do with the way she'd seamlessly woven herself into the fabric of their broken family. When Emma finally drifted back to sleep, they remained sitting on either side of her small form, neither wanting to break the spell of intimacy that had settled over the room. Christopher became acutely aware of Tamika's presence just inches away. The way her breathing matched the rhythm of Emma's, the gentle warmth that seemed to radiate from her skin. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the darkness. Tamika looked up at him across Emma's sleeping form, and their eyes met with an intensity that made his heart skip several beats. "She needed her father," she replied softly. "She's always needed her father." The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of recognition, acknowledgement of his failures combined with faith in his ability to do better. Something passed between them in that moment, a current of understanding that went far beyond professional boundaries or appropriate employee-employer relationships. "I don't know how to do this," Christopher admitted, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for too long. "I don't know how to be what she needs." "You just were," Tamika said simply. "You showed up. You stayed. You let her know she matters more than whatever you were doing in that office." Her words hit him with the force of revelation, mainly because they were true. For the first time since Sarah's death, he'd chosen Emma over work, connection over control, presence over the safe distance that protected him from further loss. And Emma had responded with the kind of trust he'd thought he'd forfeited forever. As they finally prepared to leave Emma's room, moving with the careful coordination of two people trying not to wake a sleeping child, Christopher felt Tamika's hand brush against his arm. The contact was brief, probably accidental, but it sent electricity shooting through his entire nervous system. They stood in the hallway outside Emma's door, suddenly alone together in a way that felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. The intimacy they'd just shared over Emma's bedside had shifted something fundamental between them, dissolving barriers that professional distance had been designed to maintain. "I should go home," Tamika said quietly, but she made no move toward the stairs that led to the front door. "You should," Christopher agreed, but his voice carried no conviction, and his body seemed to move closer to her, rather than stepping away. They were standing too close now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes and count the individual curl patterns in her hair. Close enough that the scent of her perfume mixed with something uniquely her, warm and inviting and absolutely intoxicating. "Christopher," she whispered, and hearing his name on her lips sent heat spiraling through his body in ways that had nothing to do with appropriate professional relationships and everything to do with the raw attraction that had been building between them for weeks. His hand moved without conscious direction, reaching up to cup her cheek with a tenderness that surprised them both. Her skin was impossibly soft beneath his palm, and when she leaned into his touch with a sigh that sounded like surrender, Christopher felt something inside his chest crack wide open. "This is dangerous," he murmured, even as his thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone with reverent precision. "I know," she replied, but her hands came up to rest against his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt like she was anchoring herself to him. They stood suspended in that moment, breathing the same air, hearts racing with the same rhythm, both of them balanced on the knife's edge between propriety and the desperate need that had been growing between them like a living thing. The sound of Emma stirring in her sleep broke the spell, reminding them both of the child sleeping just feet away and the complex responsibilities that made this attraction so impossible to act upon. Tamika stepped back first, her hands falling away from his chest, leaving him cold despite the warmth that still hummed between them. "Good night, Christopher," she said, his name a whispered caress that would haunt his dreams for hours. "Good night," he replied, watching her walk toward the stairs with fluid grace that made his mouth go dry. Long after she'd gone, Christopher stood in that hallway, his hands still tingling from the memory of her skin, his body humming with awakened need he'd thought was buried forever. Emma's nightmare had cracked something open in all of them. His daughter's trust, his own capacity for emotional connection, and the carefully maintained professional distance that had been the only thing keeping him sane. As he finally made his way to his own bedroom, Christopher knew that everything had changed tonight. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface of their relationship had evolved into something far more dangerous. Genuine affection, mixed with the kind of physical desire that made rational thought nearly impossible. He was falling for his daughter's nanny, the woman who'd brought light back into their lives, and he had absolutely no idea how to navigate the complicated emotions that admission brought with it. All he knew was that the thought of losing Tamika felt almost as devastating as losing Sarah had been, and that realization terrified him more than any nightmare Emma could ever have. The next morning brought an awkwardness that neither of them seemed to know how to navigate. Tamika arrived at her usual time, but there was a careful politeness to her demeanor that felt like armor against the intimacy they'd shared the night before. Christopher found himself stealing glances at her throughout breakfast, noting the way she avoided direct eye contact and maintained slightly more physical distance than usual. Emma, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling between the adults, chattered happily about her improved sleep and the special breakfast Tamika had prepared, heart-shaped pancakes that she claimed tasted like sunshine. Her joy was infectious, but it also served as a stark reminder of what was at stake if Christopher allowed his attraction to Tamika to complicate their carefully rebuilt family dynamic. The week that followed their charged encounter in the hallway was a masterclass in restrained longing. Christopher found himself hyper-aware of every interaction with Tamika, cataloging the moments when her fingers brushed his while passing Emma's homework. The way her laugh seemed to light up rooms that had been dark for too long, the casual grace with which she moved through his home as if she'd always belonged there. Tamika, for her part, seemed determined to rebuild the professional boundaries they'd nearly shattered. She arrived precisely on time, maintained appropriate distance during conversations, and avoided the kind of direct eye contact that had been setting his pulse racing for weeks. But Christopher caught her watching him sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze carrying the same confused longing that kept him awake at night. The tension between them was a living thing now, crackling through every shared space and making even mundane interactions feel charged with possibility. When she handed him his morning coffee, their fingers would touch for just a moment longer than necessary. When he helped Emma with homework while Tamika cooked dinner, he found himself stealing glances at the elegant curve of her neck, the way her hips swayed as she moved around the kitchen, the unconscious sensuality that seemed to emanate from her very existence. Emma thrived in the atmosphere of barely contained electricity. Though she remained blissfully unaware of its source, her nightmares had virtually disappeared since the night both adults had stayed with her, and she'd begun displaying a confidence and joy that reminded Christopher painfully of the little girl she'd been, before loss taught her to guard her heart. Have you ever experienced that moment when someone walks into your life and everything changes, even though you're fighting it every step of the way? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories start with the most resistance. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early October, when Emma developed a fever that spiked so suddenly it sent both Christopher and Tamika into protective overdrive, finally stripping away the last pretenses of professional distance between them. Emma had been slightly subdued all day, less talkative than usual during breakfast, and more inclined to curl up with books than engage in her typical energetic play. Tamika had kept a careful eye on her, noting the flush in her cheeks and the way she seemed to move more slowly than normal, but Emma had insisted she felt fine when asked directly. By evening, however, there was no denying that something was wrong. Emma's temperature had climbed to 102 degrees, and she lay listlessly on the living room sofa, her small body radiating heat, while chills made her tremble beneath the blanket Tamika had tucked around her. "Should we call Dr. Patterson?" Tamika asked, her professional composure cracking slightly as she smoothed Emma's hair back from her flushed forehead. The little girl's skin felt like fire beneath her palm, and her breathing seemed more labored than it should be for a simple cold. Christopher was already reaching for his phone, his face tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from having already lost too much to chance. "I'm calling him now, and if he can't come here, we're taking her to the hospital." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of medical consultations, temperature monitoring, and the kind of round-the-clock vigilance that only emerged when a child's well-being hung in the balance. Dr. Patterson made a house call, a privilege of wealth that Christopher had never been more grateful for, and diagnosed Emma with a viral infection that would require careful monitoring but wasn't immediately dangerous. "Keep her fever down with alternating medications every 4 hours," the elderly physician instructed as he packed his medical bag. "Plenty of fluids, and call me immediately if her temperature goes above 103 or if she shows any signs of difficulty breathing. These things usually run their course in 48 to 72 hours." After the doctor left, Christopher and Tamika settled into the rhythm of crisis care that transformed his sterile penthouse into something resembling a real home. They took turns holding Emma when she was restless, coaxing her to sip water and broth, administering medications with the precision of a hospital nursing team. As the night wore on, Emma's fever continued to spike and break in cycles that kept both adults on edge. Neither of them discussed the sleeping arrangements or who would take which shift. They simply moved around each other with the natural coordination of partners who'd been caring for children together for years rather than weeks. "I can take the night shift," Christopher told Tamika around midnight, after they'd successfully gotten Emma's temperature down to 101 and she'd finally drifted into restless sleep. "You should go home and get some rest." "I'm not leaving," Tamika replied, settling more comfortably in the chair beside Emma's bed. "Not when she's this sick. What if her fever spikes again and you need help?" The simple declaration hit Christopher with unexpected force. Here was this woman, employed for barely a month, choosing to spend her night caring for his sick daughter with the dedication of someone who genuinely loved Emma. Not because it was her job, but because she couldn't bear the thought of leaving a child she cared about when that child needed her most. "Tamika," he started, his voice rough with emotions he was struggling to contain. "Don't," she said softly, not looking away from Emma's sleeping form. "Don't thank me or tell me it's not necessary. She's not just your daughter anymore, Christopher. I love her too." The confession hung in the quiet room like a benediction, acknowledging what they'd all been feeling but hadn't dared to voice. Emma had become more than just Christopher's child in Tamika's care. She'd become the little girl Tamika loved as if she were her own, the bridge that had connected two adults who'd been afraid to hope for the kind of family they were accidentally creating together. They spent the darkest hours of the night taking turns dozing in the chair beside Emma's bed, rousing each other when medication times arrived, or when Emma's restless movements suggested her fever was climbing again. in the soft glow of the nightlight, with Emma's labored breathing providing a soundtrack to their vigil, the last barriers between Christopher and Tamika finally crumbled completely. "She looks so much like Sarah when she's sleeping," Christopher whispered during one of their medication rotations, his voice breaking slightly as he smoothed the damp hair back from Emma's flushed forehead. "Tell me about her," Tamika said quietly, settling back into the chair while Christopher remained perched on the edge of Emma's bed. "Tell me about Sarah." And so, in the intimate darkness of his daughter's sick room, Christopher found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away since Sarah's death. He told Tamika about Sarah's laugh, the way she'd sung off-key while cooking dinner, her fierce protectiveness when it came to Emma's happiness. He described their courtship, their wedding, the joy of Emma's birth, and the devastating 18 months of treatments that had ultimately failed to save the woman who'd been the center of his world. "She would have liked you," he said eventually, the words surprising him as they left his mouth. "Sarah always said Emma needed strong women in her life who wouldn't be intimidated by her intelligence or her strong will. She would have been grateful that Emma found you." Tamika's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "I wish I could have known her. Emma talks about her sometimes, you know. Little memories that she's not sure are real or dreams." "What does she say?" Christopher asked, leaning forward with the desperate hunger of a man who'd been starved for connections to his late wife. "That Mommy used to sing while she braided Emma's hair. That she made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. That she always smelled like flowers and promises." Tamika's voice was soft with the reverence due to sacred memories. "Emma's afraid she's forgetting her mother's face, but she remembers her mother's love." The words hit Christopher like a physical blow, mainly because they revealed how much his daughter had been struggling with grief while he'd been too wrapped up in his own pain to notice. "I should have been talking to her about Sarah all along," he said, his voice thick with guilt and regret. "You're talking to her now," Tamika replied gently. "You're here now. That's what matters." Emma stirred between them, her fever-bright eyes opening to focus on their faces with the disoriented confusion of sick children waking in unfamiliar circumstances. "Daddy? Miss Tamika? I don't feel good." "We know, sweetheart," Christopher said, immediately shifting into caretaker mode as he reached for the thermometer. "Let's check your temperature and see if you need more medicine." As they worked together to make Emma comfortable, Christopher supporting her while Tamika coaxed her to sip water, both of them murmuring reassurances while they checked her temperature and administered medications, something shifted in the atmosphere around them. The domestic intimacy of caring for a sick child together felt natural in a way that transcended professional boundaries or careful emotional distance. "Will you stay with me?" Emma asked, her small hand reaching for Tamika's with the desperate grip of a child who'd learned too young that people disappeared when you needed them most. "Of course, sunshine," Tamika replied, settling back into the chair while keeping Emma's hand clasped in hers. "We're both staying right here until you feel better." "Both of you?" Emma's voice was small and hopeful, her fever-bright gaze moving between the two adults who'd become her entire world. "Both of us," Christopher confirmed, his own voice rough with emotions he was barely keeping contained. "We're not going anywhere." As Emma drifted back into fitful sleep, her small hand still clutching Tamika's while her feet rested against Christopher's leg, the three of them formed a tableau of accidental family that felt more real than any legal document or formal arrangement could ever make it. "This is what I was afraid of," Tamika whispered into the quiet darkness, her free hand wiping away tears that had started falling without her permission. "What?" Christopher asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Loving you both so much that I can't imagine my life without you," she replied, her voice breaking on the confession. "I came here to be Emma's nanny, and somehow I became this, part of your family, part of your lives. And I'm terrified because I know how easily everything beautiful can disappear." Christopher felt something crack open in his chest at her words. Not breaking, but expanding to make room for emotions he'd thought he'd never feel again. Here was this incredible woman, scared of love but brave enough to embrace it anyway, choosing to stay with his sick daughter through the night, not because it was her job, but because she genuinely cared. "Look at me," he said softly, waiting until her tear-filled eyes met his across Emma's sleeping form. "I'm terrified too. I've been half dead for 3 years, convinced that loving someone meant signing up to lose them. But watching you with Emma, feeling what I feel when I'm with you, I'm more afraid of not loving you than I am of losing you." The confession hung between them in the intimate darkness, loaded with implications that went far beyond professional relationships or carefully maintained boundaries. Christopher was admitting that he loved her, not just was attracted to her or grateful for her care of Emma, but genuinely, desperately in love with the woman who'd brought light back into their lives. "Christopher," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like prayer and invitation combined. "I love you," he said, the words feeling like jumping off a cliff and discovering he could fly. "I love the way you make Emma laugh, the way you've made this house feel like a home, the way you challenge me to be better than the man I've been. I love your strength and your gentleness, and the way you see beauty in broken things." Tamika's tears were falling freely now, her hand tightening around Emma's, while her eyes never left Christopher's face. "I love you too," she whispered back. "I love your daughter and your wounded heart, and the way you're learning to live again. I love the family we're becoming, even though it terrifies me." Emma shifted in her sleep between them, her fever finally beginning to break as dawn approached, and Christopher knew that this moment would be etched in his memory forever. Not just because it was when they'd finally stopped fighting their feelings, but because it was when he'd realized that healing didn't mean forgetting what he'd lost. It meant having the courage to build something new from the ashes of grief. "When Emma's better," he said, his voice carrying promises he'd never thought he'd be brave enough to make again. "When we don't have to worry about fevers and medications and crisis care, I want to show you how much you mean to me. I want to love you the way you deserve to be loved." "I want that too," Tamika replied, her voice breathless with hope and desire and the kind of trust that made his heart race. "I want all of it, the complicated parts and the beautiful parts and everything in between." As the sun began to rise outside Emma's bedroom windows, painting their vigil in soft golden light, Christopher felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: complete peace about the future. Emma's fever had broken, her breathing was easier, and the woman he loved was holding his daughter's hand like she'd never let go. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made promises that would reshape every aspect of their carefully constructed lives. But as Christopher watched Tamika smooth Emma's hair with maternal tenderness while his daughter slept peacefully between them, he knew he'd never made a better decision than falling in love with the woman who'd saved them both. The crisis that had brought them together emotionally would soon pass, but what they'd discovered about love and family and the courage to hope again would last forever. Christopher just had no idea how much more complicated and beautiful their story was about to become. 2 days later, with Emma fully recovered and back to her usual spirited self, the reality of what had changed between Christopher and Tamika settled over their household like morning light after a long night, illuminating everything, making the familiar suddenly seem transformed and electric. The morning after Emma's fever broke completely, Christopher had awakened in his bedroom to find Tamika already gone. Though the lingering scent of her perfume on his pillows and the indent her head had left on the pillow beside his served as proof that the most incredible night of his life hadn't been an elaborate dream. He'd found her in the kitchen, fully dressed and preparing Emma's breakfast with the same professional efficiency she'd always displayed. But when their eyes met across the marble countertop, the heat that flared between them could have powered the entire building. "Good morning," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral despite the way her pulse visibly quickened at the base of her throat. "Good morning," he'd replied, and somehow those simple words had carried enough electricity to make them both catch their breath. Emma's delighted chatter about feeling better had provided a buffer against the intensity crackling between the adults, but Christopher found himself hyper-aware of every movement Tamika made, every casual touch as she checked Emma's forehead for lingering fever, every smile that seemed brighter and more intimate than before their night together. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now every interaction carried the weight of new intimacy alongside the careful dance of figuring out what came next. Professional boundaries had been obliterated, but the practical realities of their situation, employer and employee, father and nanny, man and woman, building something unprecedented from the ruins of grief, required navigation neither of them had experience with. The first real test came that afternoon, when Christopher's business partner Kelvin Miller made an unexpected visit to discuss quarterly projections and found Christopher working from home instead of the office for the third day that week. "Since when do you conduct business from your kitchen table?" Kelvin asked, settling his large frame into one of the dining room chairs while casting curious glances toward the living room, where Tamika and Emma were engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate art project involving enough glitter to redecorate the Statue of Liberty. Christopher followed his friend's gaze, unable to suppress the smile that tugged at his lips as he watched Tamika patiently help Emma create what she was calling the most beautiful picture in the whole world. The scene was domestic in a way his penthouse had never been, comfortable chaos that somehow made the expensive space feel like an actual home. "Emma was sick," Christopher replied, pulling his attention back to the financial report spread across his dining table. "I wanted to be here while she recovered." "Sick enough to miss 3 days of work?" Kelvin's tone was neutral, but Christopher caught the underlying note of concern. They'd been business partners for 8 years, friends even longer, and Kelvin knew him well enough to recognize when something fundamental had shifted. Before Christopher could answer, Emma's delighted squeal echoed from the living room, followed by Tamika's warm laughter. The sound seemed to wrap around Christopher's chest like a physical embrace, and he found himself turning toward it like a plant seeking sunlight. "She's good with Emma," Kelvin observed, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was measuring more than just childcare skills. "She is," Christopher agreed, not trusting himself to elaborate. They worked in relative silence for the next hour, reviewing projections and discussing market strategies, but Christopher was acutely aware of the domestic symphony playing out in his living room. Emma's animated chatter about her art project, Tamika's patient responses and gentle corrections, the easy rhythm of two people who'd learned to move around each other with natural grace. When Tamika appeared in the doorway to announce that she was taking Emma to the park for fresh air and exercise, Christopher felt his chest tighten with the kind of possessive protectiveness that had nothing to do with employer-employee relationships and everything to do with the man who was desperately in love with the woman standing in his dining room. "We'll be back by 4, she said, her professional tone belied by the way her gaze lingered on his face just a moment longer than appropriate. "Emma wants to show you her artwork when it's finished." "I'll be here," Christopher replied, and somehow those 3 words carried enough weight to make Tamika's breath catch slightly before she turned away. After they left, the penthouse felt hollow in a way it hadn't since before Tamika's arrival. Christopher found himself listening for the sound of Emma's laughter, anticipating Tamika's return with an intensity that should have alarmed him, but instead felt as natural as breathing. "So," Kelvin said into the quiet, his tone deceptively casual, "want to tell me what's really going on here?" Christopher looked up from the contract he'd been pretending to review, meeting his friend's knowing gaze with as much composure as he could muster. "I don't know what you mean." "Chris?" Kelvin's voice carried the patience of someone who'd known him long enough to recognize evasion when he heard it. "I've been watching you for the past hour. You haven't absorbed a single word of these financial reports because you've been tracking every sound from that living room like a man obsessed. Either Emma's nanny is the most fascinating childcare provider in Manhattan, or something else is going on here." The observation hit closer to home than Christopher was prepared to handle. He set down his pen, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find words for a situation that defied easy explanation. "It's complicated," he said finally. "The best things usually are," Kelvin replied, settling back in his chair with the air of someone prepared to wait for the whole story. "Talk to me, man. What's got you working from home and looking like you've discovered fire?" Christopher found himself studying his hands, noting the way they'd trembled slightly when Tamika had smiled at him that morning, the way his pulse still quickened when he thought about holding her through the night while Emma slept peacefully between them. "I think I'm falling in love with her," he admitted, the words feeling like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. "Think?" Kelvin's eyebrows rose with gentle skepticism. "Chris, I've known you for 15 years. I've never seen you look at anyone the way you looked at that woman when she walked into this room, not even Sarah." The comparison should have felt like betrayal, but instead it felt like recognition, acknowledgement of something Christopher had been too afraid to examine too closely. What he felt for Tamika was different from what he'd shared with Sarah. Not better or worse, but different in the way that second chances were different from first loves. Deeper for having been earned through loss and healing rather than discovered through youthful passion. "It's complicated," Christopher repeated, the words inadequate for the tangle of emotions, responsibilities, and fears that came with loving his daughter's nanny. "Because she works for you? Because she's Emma's caregiver? Because I'm her boss? Because if this goes wrong, Emma loses another person she loves?" Christopher's voice roughened with the weight of what was at stake. "Because I'm not sure I know how to love someone without being terrified of losing them." Kelvin was quiet for a long moment, studying Christopher's face with the kind of focused attention that had made him such a successful business partner. "Can I ask you something? When was the last time you were happy? Not successful, not satisfied with a deal or a conquest, but genuinely, bone-deep happy?" The question hit Christopher like a physical blow, mainly because the answer was so immediate and so recent. "This morning," he said quietly. "When I woke up and Emma was feeling better, and Tamika was in my kitchen making breakfast, and for about 10 minutes, my life felt complete. Then maybe the risk is worth it," Kelvin said simply. "Maybe the question isn't whether you can afford to love her, but whether you can afford not to." Before Christopher could respond, the sound of Emma's laughter echoed through the penthouse as she and Tamika returned from their park adventure. Emma burst through the front door like a small tornado, her cheeks flushed with fresh air and excitement, Tamika following with the patient smile of someone who'd learned to find joy in a child's endless energy. "Daddy, Mr. Kelvin," Emma announced, racing toward the dining room with something clutched in her small hands. "Look what Miss Tamika and I found at the park." She thrust her prize toward them. A collection of autumn leaves in brilliant shades of red and gold, already pressed between sheets of wax paper with the kind of careful preservation that suggested Tamika had anticipated Emma's desire to keep her treasures forever. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Christopher said, accepting the leaf collection with the reverence due to precious gifts. "We'll have to find the perfect place to display them. Miss Tamika says we can make a whole book of beautiful things," Emma continued, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. "Leaves and flowers and maybe some of my drawings. She says beautiful things are worth keeping forever." Christopher's eyes found Tamika's across the room, noting the way she was watching his interaction with Emma with soft approval and something deeper. Something that looked like love for both of them, not just the child she cared for professionally. "Miss Wood sounds very wise," Kelvin said, his tone carrying just enough emphasis to make Christopher aware that his friend was making his own assessments about the woman who'd transformed his household. "She is," Emma agreed solemnly. "She knows about lots of things, like how to make sad people happy, and how to help sick people feel better, and how to make the most beautiful gardens." The innocent description hit Christopher with unexpected force, mainly because it was such an accurate summary of what Tamika had done for their family. She hadn't just cared for Emma professionally, she'd tended to all of them with the same patient dedication Emma attributed to gardening, nurturing growth in spaces that had been barren for too long. As the afternoon wore on, Christopher found himself watching the easy interaction between Kelvin and Tamika, noting how she handled his friend's subtle questioning with grace and intelligence, never overstepping her role as Emma's caregiver, but also never diminishing her own worth in the conversation. She was, Christopher realized, exactly the kind of woman he'd want in his life, even if Emma weren't part of the equation. Strong, compassionate, unintimidated by wealth or status, capable of holding her own in any situation. After Kelvin left, with promises to review the revised projections and several meaningful glances that suggested their conversation about Tamika was far from over, Christopher found himself alone with the two females who'd become the center of his universe. Emma was coloring at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she worked on what appeared to be a family portrait featuring three figures holding hands in front of a house covered in flowers. Tamika moved around the kitchen preparing dinner, her movements fluid and natural in the space she'd gradually made her own. "She's drawing us," Tamika said quietly, pausing beside Christopher's chair to look over Emma's artwork. "Look at the way she positioned everyone." Christopher studied the drawing, noting that Emma had placed the three figures very close together, their stick figure hands intertwined, their paper faces decorated with enormous smiles. It was the drawing of a child who felt secure and loved, who saw the adults in her life as a unit, rather than separate entities who happened to share the same space. "She sees us as a family," he said, the words carrying weight that had nothing to do with legal definitions or traditional arrangements. "Is that what we are?" Tamika asked, her voice soft with hope and uncertainty combined. Christopher turned in his chair to face her fully, noting the way the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen windows turned her skin golden, the way her eyes held both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. This was the woman who'd stayed up all night caring for his sick daughter, who'd held him while he cried about failing as a father, who'd made love to him with a tenderness that had cracked his heart wide open. "I want us to be," he said, the confession feeling like the most important words he'd ever spoken. "I want whatever this is between us to be real and permanent, and everything Emma sees when she draws pictures of us together." Tamika's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek with the same reverent gentleness she'd shown during Emma's illness. "I want that too," she whispered, "more than I've ever wanted anything." Before Christopher could respond, Emma looked up from her drawing with the satisfied expression of someone who'd completed an important project. "All done," she announced, holding up her masterpiece. "It's us in our garden house, where we're all happy, forever and ever." The innocent words hit both adults like a revelation, mainly because they perfectly captured what neither of them had been able to articulate. They were building something together, not just a relationship or a family arrangement, but a home where happiness could grow and flourish despite the losses they'd all endured. "It's perfect, sunshine," Tamika said, her voice thick with emotion as she studied Emma's vision of their future. "The most beautiful picture I've ever seen." As evening settled over the city, and they moved through the familiar rhythm of dinner and homework and bedtime stories, Christopher felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's illness. The deep contentment that came from being exactly where he belonged, with exactly the people who mattered most. But peace, he was about to discover, was a fragile thing, and happiness built on the foundation of complicated love was about to face its first real test. The challenge arrived the next morning in the form of an unexpected phone call that would force Christopher to confront the reality that loving Tamika meant more than just private declarations and stolen kisses. It meant defending their relationship against a world that might not understand how a billionaire widower, his young daughter, and their nanny had accidentally created something beautiful from the ashes of grief. As Christopher's phone rang with the call that would change everything, he had no idea that the life he'd finally learned to embrace was about to be threatened by forces beyond his control. All he knew was that he loved the woman making breakfast in his kitchen and the child who saw them all as a forever family, and he was prepared to fight for that love no matter what the cost. The phone call came at 7:30 the next morning while Christopher was watching Tamika help Emma practice piano scales in the living room. The domestic scene, Emma's focused concentration, Tamika's patient encouragement, the morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows to illuminate the family he'd never dared to hope for, made the harsh ring of his business line feel like an intrusion from another world. "Christopher Holland?" he answered, his voice carrying the professional authority that had built his empire, but felt strangely foreign in the warm atmosphere of his transformed home. "Mr. Holland, this is Patricia Blackwood from the Whitmore Academy." The woman's voice was crisp with the kind of authority that came from decades of managing Manhattan's elite children. "I'm calling regarding Emma's enrollment for next year." Christopher felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he couldn't immediately identify why a routine call from Emma's prospective school would trigger such unease. "Of course. Is there a problem with her application?" "Not with her application, no," Patricia replied, her tone carrying subtle disapproval that made Christopher's jaw tighten. "However, we've received some concerning information about changes in Emma's home environment that we feel obligated to discuss." The words hit Christopher like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. He found himself gripping the phone harder, his free hand clenching into a fist as he fought to keep his voice level. "What kind of information?" "It's come to our attention that you've become involved with your daughter's caregiver," Patricia continued, her pause before the word "involved" loaded with implications that made Christopher's blood pressure spike. "The Whitmore Academy has very strict standards regarding the moral environment of our students' homes. We simply cannot tolerate situations that might reflect poorly on our institution's reputation." Christopher's vision went red around the edges, fury building in his chest like a physical force. "Are you suggesting that my private life is somehow inappropriate for my daughter?" "I'm suggesting that a widowed father carrying on an affair with his employee, a significantly younger employee, I might add, creates exactly the kind of scandal that our families work very hard to avoid." Patricia's voice remained maddeningly composed, as if she were discussing weather patterns rather than threatening to destroy his family's future. "Emma is a lovely child, but we must consider the broader implications of accepting students from unconventional households." The euphemism hit Christopher like a slap, mainly because he understood exactly what she was really saying. A billionaire tech mogul, falling in love with his black nanny, was the kind of story that gossip columnists and society magazines lived for, and institutions like Whitmore Academy survived by avoiding any association with scandal, regardless of the truth behind the headlines. "Ms. Blackwood," Christopher said, his voice dropping to the dangerous calm that had made hostile corporate takeovers tremble, "I suggest you reconsider whatever source provided you with information about my personal life. Emma's home environment is loving, stable, and completely appropriate." "Nevertheless," Patricia replied, unfazed by his tone, "the Academy's board has voted to withdraw Emma's acceptance pending resolution of this situation. Should you choose to end your inappropriate relationship and return to a more suitable domestic arrangement, we would be happy to reconsider her enrollment." The line went dead, leaving Christopher staring at his phone with the kind of rage that came from being attacked through the people he loved most. Someone had been watching his family, gathering information about his relationship with Tamika, and using that intelligence to threaten Emma's future. The violation felt personal in a way that no business betrayal ever had. "Christopher?" Tamika's voice, soft with concern, made him realize he'd been standing frozen in his home office doorway for several minutes. "Is everything okay?" He turned to find her watching him with worried eyes. Emma still at the piano, but clearly aware that something had shifted in the atmosphere of their peaceful morning. The sight of them, his daughter and the woman he loved, both vulnerable to the kind of social assassination that wealth and privilege could unleash, made his protective instincts surge with lethal intensity. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the fury still coursing through his veins. "Emma, sweetheart, why don't you practice that new song Miss Tamika taught you? We'll be right back." In the privacy of his study, with the door closed against small ears that didn't need to hear adult fears, Christopher found himself struggling to find words for the violation they'd just experienced. Someone's been watching us, he said finally, the admission tasting like poison in his mouth. Emma's been rejected from Whitmore Academy because of our relationship. Tamika went very still, her face draining of color as the implications settled over her like ice water. Someone reported us? Someone with enough influence to convince a prestigious private school that a loving relationship between consenting adults is somehow inappropriate for a child's welfare. Christopher's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the urge to break something, anything, almost overwhelming. They're using Emma to get to us. Then we stop, Tamika said immediately, her voice breaking on the words. I'll resign. I'll leave today if it means Emma doesn't suffer for our choices. No. The word exploded from Christopher with such force that Tamika actually stepped backward. Absolutely not. I will not let small-minded bigots destroy what we've built together. Christopher, if Emma can't get into good schools, then we'll find better schools, he interrupted, stepping closer to her with the intensity of a man defending his family's right to exist. Schools that judge children by their potential, rather than their parents' private lives. I will not sacrifice our happiness to appease people who think love is somehow inappropriate. Tamika's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, her hands twisting together with the kind of nervous energy that came from being trapped between impossible choices. You don't understand what this means. It's not just one school, Christopher. This is how it starts. First the schools, then the social clubs, then the business associations. They'll make our love into something dirty and scandalous, and Emma will pay the price. The pain in her voice cut through Christopher's rage like a blade, mainly because he could see the fear behind her words. Not fear of losing him, but fear of destroying the child they both loved through their association with each other. She was already calculating the cost of loving him, already preparing to sacrifice her own happiness to protect Emma from the consequences of their relationship. Look at me, he said, framing her face with his hands and forcing her to meet his gaze. I've spent 3 years being afraid of living again, afraid of risking my heart, afraid of letting Emma get too attached to anyone who might leave. I will not spend the rest of my life being afraid of loving you. But Emma needs to see that love is worth fighting for, Christopher interrupted, his thumbs wiping away the tears that had finally started falling. She needs to know that when people try to tear your family apart, you stand together and fight back. She needs to understand that happiness doesn't come from conforming to other people's narrow definitions of appropriate. Before Tamika could respond, Emma's voice echoed from the living room, calling for them to come listen to her new song. The sound of their daughter's innocent joy, untouched by the adult fears threatening to tear their world apart, reminded them both of what was truly at stake. They returned to the living room with carefully composed faces, settling on either side of Emma at the piano bench while she played a simple melody that filled the room with sweetness and light. But Christopher was acutely aware of the way Tamika held herself slightly apart now, the careful distance that hadn't existed that morning, the way she seemed to be already pulling back in preparation for leaving. The rest of the day passed in a strange, suspended animation. Both adults going through the motions of normal routine, while the weight of external threats pressed down on their newfound happiness like a physical force. Emma seemed to sense the tension without understanding its source, becoming more clingy and seeking extra reassurance from both adults that everything was okay. That evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed with extra stories and longer hugs, Christopher found Tamika standing at the living room windows, staring out at the city lights with the kind of distant expression that suggested she was already planning her escape. "Don't," he said quietly, approaching her with the careful movements of someone trying not to spook a flight-ready animal. "Don't what?" she asked, though they both knew exactly what he meant. "Don't start pulling away because other people can't handle our happiness," Christopher replied, stopping close enough to touch her, but respecting the space she seemed to need. "Don't let fear make decisions that love should be making." Tamika turned to face him, and Christopher felt his heart crack at the exhaustion and conflict written across her features. "It's not just fear, Christopher, it's reality. I knew this was too good to be true. I knew that a man like you and a woman like me, that it was temporary. A beautiful dream that would eventually have to end. A man like me and a woman like you? Christopher repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. What exactly does that mean? You know what it means, Tamika replied, her voice barely above a whisper. You're a billionaire widower with social standing and political connections and a reputation to protect. I'm your employee. I'm younger. I'm black. I'm everything those people at that school think is inappropriate for someone in your position. The words hung between them like accusations, forcing Christopher to confront the ugly reality of the world they lived in. A world where love could be judged by bank accounts and skin color, where happiness was subject to approval by people who'd never earned the right to an opinion. You're the woman I love, Christopher said fiercely, closing the distance between them despite her obvious desire for space. You're Emma's salvation and mine. You're the strongest, most compassionate, most incredible person I've ever known, and I don't give a damn what anyone else thinks about our relationship. But I do, Tamika whispered, her voice breaking on the admission. I care that Emma might suffer because of me. I care that your business might be affected. I care that our love story might become tabloid fodder that follows all of us for the rest of our lives. Christopher felt something desperate claw at his chest as he recognized the finality in her tone. She wasn't just expressing fears. She was already making the decision to leave, to sacrifice their love on the altar of social expectations and fear of future pain. So what are you saying? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. I'm saying maybe Patricia Blackwood is right, Tamika replied, tears streaming down her face as she spoke the words that felt like death sentences. Maybe Emma deserves a normal life with a father who makes conventional choices. Maybe I should go before I cause any more damage to your family's reputation. You are part of this family, Christopher shouted, his careful control finally snapping under the weight of losing everything that mattered. Emma loves you. I love you. We need you here, not hiding from small-minded people who don't know anything about the kind of woman you are. But even as he spoke the words, Christopher could see that Tamika had already begun the emotional process of leaving. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how, by running before the pain of being driven away became unbearable. The fight that followed was unlike anything Christopher had experienced. Not a battle between enemies, but the desperate struggle of two people who loved each other trying to find a path through impossible circumstances. Tamika argued for Emma's welfare and Christopher's reputation, while he argued for love and family and the courage to face whatever consequences came with choosing happiness over conformity. In the end, they reached the kind of exhausted stalemate that left both of them emotionally drained and no closer to resolution. Tamika retired to her room with the excuse of needing to think, while Christopher paced his living room like a caged animal, his mind racing through options and strategies and increasingly desperate plans to protect the family he'd finally learned to embrace. The next morning brought fresh challenges that would test not just their love, but their commitment to the unconventional family they'd built together. As Christopher prepared to fight for everything that mattered, he had no idea that the worst threats to their happiness were yet to come, or that the battle for their right to love each other was about to become a war that would reshape all of their lives forever. What he did know was that he would rather face any enemy than lose the woman who taught him to live again, and the child who saw them all as forever family. The world might not understand their love, but Christopher was prepared to change the world's mind. One heart, one school, one closed-minded institution at a time. The war for their family's future was about to begin, and Christopher Holland had never fought a battle he was more determined to win. The battle lines were drawn by 10 a.m. the following morning, when Christopher's lawyer, Margaret Chen, arrived at his penthouse with a stack of legal documents and the grim expression of someone bearing bad news. "It's worse than just the school," Margaret announced, settling her briefcase on Christopher's dining table. While Tamika busied herself in the kitchen, her movements tense with the awareness that her future was being discussed like a legal case rather than a love story. "How much worse?" Christopher asked, though the tightness in his chest suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be something he wanted to hear. 3 more private schools have withdrawn their consideration of Emma's applications, Margaret replied, spreading photographs and documents across the polished surface like evidence in a criminal trial. Someone's been very thorough in their intelligence gathering. Professional photographs of you and Miss Wood together, detailed reports of her comings and goings, even receipts from restaurants where you've been seen together. Christopher felt his blood pressure spike as he studied the surveillance materials, recognizing intimate moments he'd thought were private. Tamika laughing at something he'd said during dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. The two of them walking hand in hand through Central Park while Emma fed ducks, a particularly damning image of them kissing goodnight outside his building after their first official date. "Who's behind this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that had made corporate enemies think twice about challenging him. "That's where things get interesting," Margaret replied, producing another set of documents with the air of someone revealing the final piece of a complex puzzle. The private investigator was hired by Whitmore Academy's board of directors, but the funding came from an offshore account traced to Pemberton Holdings. The name hit Christopher like a physical blow. Recognition flooding through him with the force of betrayal realized. Pemberton Holdings was the venture capital firm run by Richard Pemberton, Sarah's former business partner and the man who'd been pursuing a hostile takeover of Christopher's company for the past 2 years. "Pemberton," Christopher said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "He's using my personal life to destroy my business reputation." "It's actually quite brilliant from a strategic standpoint," Margaret admitted reluctantly. "He can't touch you professionally. Your company's too solid, your reputation too clean. But if he can paint you as a man who preys on his employees, who's replaced his dead wife with inappropriate relationships, he damages your character in ways that affect everything from board positions to business partnerships." Christopher felt rage building in his chest like a physical force, not just at Pemberton's calculating cruelty, but at the realization that Emma was being used as collateral damage in a corporate war she didn't even know existed. "What are our options?" he asked, his mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had built his empire and would now be used to defend his family. "Legally, we're limited," Margaret replied with the honesty that made her such an effective attorney. "Private schools can reject applicants for almost any reason they choose. The surveillance was conducted legally. The real question is whether you're prepared for this to get ugly, because I guarantee Pemberton won't stop with schools." Before Christopher could respond, Emma's voice echoed from the living room where she was supposed to be doing homework. "Daddy, there are people with cameras outside our building. Mrs. Peterson from downstairs says they're reporters." The words hit both adults like bullets, the reality of their situation crystallizing into immediate, tangible threat. Their private love story was about to become public entertainment, their relationship dissected by strangers who saw only scandal where they'd built something beautiful. Tamika appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "I need to leave," she said simply. "Today. Before this gets any worse for Emma." "Absolutely not," Christopher replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded boardrooms and broken hostile takeovers. "Running away won't solve anything. It'll just confirm their narrative that we have something to be ashamed of." "Look at those pictures," Tamika said, gesturing toward the surveillance photos spread across his dining table like accusations. "Look at what they're turning our love into. Emma doesn't deserve to have her childhood destroyed by tabloid gossip about her father's inappropriate relationship with the help." The phrase "the help" hit Christopher like a slap, mainly because he could hear the voices of judgment and prejudice that had convinced Tamika to describe herself that way. She was reducing herself to a stereotype, accepting other people's narrow definitions of who she was allowed to be in his life. "You are not the help," Christopher said fiercely, crossing the room to grip her shoulders with gentle intensity. "You are the woman I love. You are Emma's salvation. You are the strongest, most incredible person I know, And I will not let Richard Pemberton or anyone else make you feel like you're something to be ashamed of. Christopher, Margaret's voice cut through their moment with professional urgency. We have a bigger problem. Channel 7 is running a story at noon about billionaire tech mogul's scandalous affair with young nanny. They're framing it as exploitation of an employee, with expert commentary about power dynamics and inappropriate workplace relationships. The room went silent, except for the sound of Emma's cartoons from the living room, innocence and childhood joy, providing stark contrast to the adult chaos threatening to destroy their carefully built happiness. Then we get ahead of it, Christopher said, his strategic mind finally overriding his emotional turmoil. We control the narrative before they do. How? Tamika asked, though her tone suggested she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. We tell our story first, Christopher replied, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who'd made his decision and would see it through, regardless of consequences. We give an exclusive interview to someone we trust, we present the truth about our relationship, and we make it clear that anyone who threatens our family will face the full force of my legal and financial resources. Margaret looked up from her legal documents with the expression of someone who just heard a client declare war on half of Manhattan society. Christopher, are you sure about this? Once you go public defending your relationship, there's no taking it back. Your reputation, your business relationships, Emma's entire future, everything will be judged through this lens. Good, Christopher replied with the kind of calm certainty that had built his empire from nothing. Let them judge. Let them see what real love looks like when it's worth fighting for. Tamika stared at him with a mixture of terror and admiration, clearly torn between the desire to run from the approaching storm and the desperate hope that their love might actually be strong enough to weather whatever came next. Are you asking me to trust you? She whispered, her voice breaking on the question that carried the weight of every fear and dream she'd been carrying. I'm asking you to trust us, Christopher replied, framing her face with his hands and forcing her to meet his gaze. I'm asking you to believe that what we have is worth defending, that Emma deserves to see love triumph over fear, and that sometimes the best way to protect your family is to fight for it publicly. The decision hung between them like a bridge over dangerous waters. Cross it, and there would be no going back to the safety of secret love and private happiness. Stay on this side, and they might lose everything to fear and the calculated cruelty of people who saw their relationship as nothing more than a weapon to be used. As Emma's laughter drifted from the living room and photographers gathered outside their building, Christopher and Tamika stood at the crossroads that would determine not just their future together, but the kind of people they chose to be when love was tested by the worst impulses of human nature. The war for their family's right to exist was about to begin, and the first battle would be fought in the court of public opinion, with Emma's happiness and their love as the ultimate prize. Daddy? Emma's voice, suddenly uncertain, drifted from the living room. Why are there so many people outside, and why do they have big cameras? The innocent question shattered the adult tension like glass, reminding both Christopher and Tamika that their decisions weren't just about their own hearts. They were about protecting a 6-year-old who'd already lost too much to adult failures and fears. Christopher exchanged a look with Tamika that carried 3 months of love, hope, and desperate determination. In her eyes, he saw his own resolve reflected back. They wouldn't let Richard Pemberton or anyone else destroy what they'd built together. Margaret, Christopher said, turning to his lawyer with the kind of focused intensity that had made him a legend in corporate America. Get me an interview with Rebecca Martinez at Channel 2. She's fair, she's thorough, and she won't let this story be twisted into something it's not. Christopher, Tamika whispered, her hand finding his arm with trembling fingers. Are you sure about this? Once we go public, Emma gets to see her father fight for the people he loves, instead of hiding from bullies. Christopher interrupted gently, covering her hand with his own. She gets to learn that when someone tries to tear your family apart, you stand together and show the world what real love looks like. Margaret was already making calls, her professional efficiency shifting into the highest gear as she negotiated terms for an exclusive interview that would either save their reputation or destroy it completely. Within an hour, she'd arranged for Rebecca Martinez and a small camera crew to come to the penthouse, where Christopher and Tamika would tell their story in their own words, surrounded by the evidence of the home they'd built together. "We need to prepare Emma," Tamika said, her maternal instincts overriding her own fears as she watched their daughter coloring at the kitchen table, blissfully unaware that her entire world was about to change. She needs to understand what's happening before she hears it from strangers. They approached Emma together, presenting a united front as they settled on either side of her at the small table where she'd been working on another family portrait, this one featuring the three of them at a picnic, surrounded by flowers and sunshine and the innocent happiness of a child who believed love conquered everything. "Sweetheart," Christopher began, his voice gentle but serious enough to capture Emma's full attention, "we need to talk to you about something important." Emma looked up from her drawing, her small face immediately reflecting the concern she heard in his tone. "Are you sick again? Is Miss Tamika going away?" The questions hit both adults like arrows, revealing fears Emma had been carrying without them realizing it. She'd learned too young that the people she loved could disappear without warning, and now she was searching their faces for signs of another abandonment. "No one is sick, and no one is going anywhere," Tamika said firmly, reaching across the table to take Emma's small hand in hers. "But there are some people who don't understand our family, and they're trying to cause problems for us." "What kind of problems?" Emma asked, her 6-year-old mind struggling to process the concept of adults actively working to hurt children. Christopher chose his words carefully, trying to explain adult cruelty in terms a child could understand without crushing her faith in the fundamental goodness of the world. "Some people think that Daddy and Miss Tamika shouldn't love each other because we're different in some ways. They don't understand that love is about hearts, not about what people look like or how much money they have." Emma frowned, her small brow furrowing with the concentration of someone working through a complex problem. "But you make each other happy," she said, as if this simple truth should be enough to solve any adult complication. "And you both make me happy. Isn't that what families do?" The innocent wisdom hit both adults with devastating force, reminding them that their daughter understood love in its purest form, uncomplicated by prejudice or social expectations or the fear that had been paralyzing them both. "That's exactly what families do," Tamika replied, her voice thick with emotion as she squeezed Emma's hand. "And that's why Daddy and I are going to talk to some people today, to help them understand what our family is really like." "On TV?" Emma asked, her eyes widening with the kind of excitement that only children could feel about being on television. "On TV," Christopher confirmed, unable to suppress a smile at his daughter's immediate enthusiasm. "We're going to tell everyone how much we love each other and how happy we are together." As they prepared for the interview that would either vindicate their love or expose them to even greater scrutiny, Christopher found himself marveling at the transformation in Tamika. The woman who'd been ready to flee that morning had shifted into protective mother mode, her fear replaced by fierce determination to defend their family against anyone who threatened Emma's happiness. She chose her outfit carefully, an elegant navy dress that was professional without being severe, her natural hair styled in soft curls that framed her face with quiet confidence. She looked, Christopher thought as he watched her prepare, like exactly what she was, a strong, intelligent, beautiful woman who deserved to be loved completely and without apology. When Rebecca Martinez arrived with her camera crew, she brought an air of professional competence mixed with genuine warmth that immediately put them at ease. Christopher had known Rebecca for years through various charity functions, and he'd specifically chosen her because she had a reputation for fairness and depth, rather than sensationalism. "I want you to know," Rebecca said as her crew set up lighting in Christopher's living room, "that this story is going to air regardless of what happens here today. The question is whether it's going to be your story or someone else's version of it." The implicit threat was delivered with gentle professionalism, but it served as a reminder of the stakes they were facing. Their love story was already public property. Now they had to fight to control how it was told. The interview began with easy questions about how they'd met, how Tamika had come to work for Christopher, what their daily life was like with Emma. But as Rebecca probed deeper, the questions became more challenging, designed to address the very accusations that were being whispered in social circles and printed in gossip columns. There are people saying this is an inappropriate relationship between an employer and employee, Rebecca said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp with professional interest. How do you respond to suggestions that there's an inherent power imbalance that makes this relationship exploitative? Christopher felt his protective instinct surge, but before he could respond, Tamika spoke with quiet dignity that commanded immediate respect. I have a master's degree in child development, she said, meeting Rebecca's gaze directly. I chose to work as a nanny because I believe in the importance of nurturing children during their most formative years. I wasn't some vulnerable employee who could be taken advantage of. I was a professional who fell in love with a man who happened to be my employer, and who chose to build a family with him because we share the same values and the same commitment to Emma's well-being. And you, Mr. Holland? Rebecca asked, turning her attention to Christopher. Critics suggest you're replacing your late wife with someone inappropriate for your social position. The question was designed to wound, but Christopher had been preparing for it since the moment he decided to go public with their relationship. His answer came from 3 years of grief, months of healing, and the absolute certainty that came from finally understanding the difference between replacing what he'd lost and building something new from the ashes. Sarah was the love of my youth, he said, his voice steady despite the emotions underlying his words. She gave me Emma and taught me what it meant to be a husband and father. Her death nearly destroyed me, and for 3 years I thought that was where my story ended. Tamika didn't replace Sarah. She saved me from disappearing entirely. She brought light back into Emma's life and taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means having the courage to love again. As the interview continued, something magical began to happen. The artificial lighting and professional cameras couldn't diminish the genuine warmth that existed between the three of them. The easy affection and natural family dynamic that spoke louder than any words about the authenticity of their relationship. When Emma made a surprise appearance, having snuck out of her room to see what all the excitement was about, her innocent comments provided the most powerful testimony of all. Miss Tamika makes the best pancakes, she told Rebecca with the serious tone of someone sharing important information. And she reads voices for all the characters in my bedtime stories. And when I have bad dreams, both of them come to make me feel better, and then I'm not scared anymore. It sounds like you're very happy, Rebecca observed, her professional demeanor softening in the face of Emma's unguarded joy. I am happy, Emma confirmed. Daddy used to be sad all the time, but now he smiles and laughs and plays games with me, and Miss Tamika is teaching me how to make gardens grow, even when they look dead. She says beautiful things are worth taking care of, even when other people don't understand why they're special. The words, delivered with 6-year-old sincerity, provided a perfect summary of what their family had become. A place where broken things could heal, where love was worth fighting for, where a child could grow up understanding that families came in many forms, but were always built on the same foundation of care and commitment. After the camera crew left, promising that the story would air that evening, Christopher and Tamika found themselves alone in their living room, emotionally drained, but strangely peaceful. They'd done everything they could to control their narrative. Now they had to wait and see whether the court of public opinion would be moved by truth or swayed by prejudice. No matter what happens, Christopher said, pulling Tamika into his arms with the desperation of a man who'd found his salvation and refused to let it go, I want you to know that I've never been prouder of anything than I am of loving you. Even if it costs you everything? Tamika asked, her voice muffled against his chest. You and Emma are everything, Christopher replied, his arms tightening around her as if he could protect her from the judgment of the entire world through sheer force of will. Everything else is just details. That evening, they watched the interview together, all three of them curled on the sofa like any family watching themselves on television. Emma was delighted to see herself on TV, pointing out every moment with the enthusiasm of someone experiencing fame for the first time. But Christopher and Tamika watched with the tension of people whose entire future hung in the balance, noting every edit, every question that had been included or excluded, every moment that might be interpreted as confirmation or contradiction of the accusations against them. The story that aired was fair, balanced, and ultimately sympathetic to their situation. Rebecca had done exactly what Christopher had hoped. She'd presented their relationship as a genuine love story between two adults who'd found healing and happiness together, rather than the scandalous exploitation narrative that their enemies had been promoting. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Social media exploded with opinions ranging from supportive to vicious. Team Holland trending alongside billionaire scandal as people chose sides in a story that had somehow become larger than the three people at its center. But the reaction that mattered most came the next morning, when Christopher's phone rang with calls from 3 different private schools, all expressing interest in reconsidering Emma's application. The interview had accomplished exactly what he'd hoped. It had forced people to see their relationship as human and real, rather than theoretical and scandalous. More importantly, Emma bounded into the kitchen that morning with the same joy she'd shown every day since Tamika had entered their lives, her happiness untouched by adult fears and social judgment. She was still the confident, loved child they'd been working to nurture, and that was the only victory that truly mattered. As Christopher watched Tamika help Emma with her breakfast while morning sunlight streamed through their kitchen windows, he realized that they'd survived their first real test as a family. They'd faced the worst impulses of human nature and emerged stronger, more committed, and more certain than ever that love was worth whatever battles came with defending it. But even as relief flooded through him, Christopher knew that Richard Pemberton wouldn't give up easily. The first battle had been won, but the war for their family's right to exist was far from over. He just had no idea that the final test of their love would come from an unexpected source, or that the resolution of their story would require a sacrifice that would transform all of their lives in ways none of them could imagine. The call that would change everything came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that had started like every other day since their successful interview. Emma was at school, Tamika was planning afternoon activities, and Christopher was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in over 3 years. Christopher. The voice was familiar but changed, aged by grief and time in ways that made his chest tighten with recognition and guilt. It's Vivian Whitmore, Sarah's mother. Christopher felt the world tilt slightly on its axis as he processed the sound of his former mother-in-law's voice. Vivian Whitmore had been conspicuously absent from their lives since Sarah's funeral, her grief too raw and her blame too sharp for her to maintain a relationship with the man she held responsible for her daughter's final months of suffering. "Vivian," he managed, his voice carefully neutral despite the emotions churning in his chest. "How are you?" "I'm dying," she said with the blunt honesty that had always characterized her communication style. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say I have maybe 2 months." The words hit Christopher like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of unfinished business and complicated grief. Vivian had been Sarah's closest confidant, the woman who'd raised the love of his life and who'd never forgiven him for surviving when her daughter hadn't. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it despite the complicated history between them. "Is there anything I can do?" "There is, actually," Vivian replied, her voice carrying the kind of careful control that suggested she'd been planning this conversation for some time. "I want to see Emma. I want to spend time with my granddaughter before I join Sarah." The request was simple on its surface, but Christopher understood immediately the complications it would bring. Vivian had never met Tamika, had no idea that Emma had had another maternal figure in her life, and would undoubtedly see their relationship as a betrayal of Sarah's memory. Of course, Christopher heard himself saying, because denying a dying woman time with her granddaughter was impossible, regardless of personal complications. "When would you like to visit?" "I'd like to stay for a while if that's possible," Vivian said, her tone suggesting she was asking for more than just accommodation. "I've been living in Florida since Sarah died, but I want to come home to New York for whatever time I have left. I want to be close to Emma, to be part of her life in whatever way I can." Christopher felt something cold settle in his stomach as he processed the implications of what she was asking. Vivian Holland was a force of nature even when healthy. Brilliant, opinionated, and absolutely devoted to preserving Sarah's memory in every possible way. Having her live in their home while they navigated their new relationship dynamic would be like introducing a lit match to gasoline. But she was also Emma's grandmother, Sarah's mother, and the only remaining connection his daughter had to half of her heritage. Refusing her request was unthinkable, even if granting it might destroy the happiness they'd fought so hard to protect. "You can have the guest suite," Christopher said, his strategic mind already working through the logistics and potential complications. "When would you like to arrive?" "This weekend if possible," Vivian replied. "And Christopher, I've seen the news coverage. I know about your relationship with Emma's nanny. We'll need to discuss that situation when I arrive." The line went dead, leaving Christopher staring at his phone with the growing certainty that their hard-won peace was about to be tested in ways that made Richard Pemberton's corporate warfare look like child's play. When Tamika returned from the grocery store that afternoon, she found Christopher pacing his home office with the restless energy of a man processing impossible decisions. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, her intuition for his moods having finely tuned by months of loving him. "You look like you've received terrible news." "Sarah's mother is coming to stay with us," Christopher said without preamble, knowing there was no way to deliver this information that wouldn't feel like a bomb exploding in the middle of their carefully constructed happiness. "She's dying, and she wants to spend her remaining time with Emma." Tamika went very still, her face cycling through a range of emotions. Understanding, fear, and the kind of resigned sadness that came from recognizing when happiness was about to be tested beyond its limits. "She doesn't know about us," Tamika said, and it wasn't a question. "She knows," Christopher replied grimly. "She's seen the news coverage, and based on her tone, she's not pleased about Emma having another maternal figure in her life." They stood in his office, separated by 3 feet of expensive carpet, and the growing recognition that everything they'd built together was about to face its most serious challenge. Vivian Holland wasn't some corporate rival or society gossip. She was family, with rights and claims that couldn't be dismissed or legally challenged. "Maybe I should find somewhere else to stay while she's here," Tamika suggested, her voice carefully neutral despite the pain Christopher could see in her eyes. "It might be easier for everyone if—" "No," Christopher interrupted, the word explosive in its intensity. "Absolutely not. You live here. This is your home. Emma is your daughter in every way that matters, and I will not ask you to hide from a woman who's grieving her way into our lives." But even as he spoke the words, Christopher could see the doubt creeping into Tamika's expression, the fear that their love might not be strong enough to survive the judgment of someone who had every right to an opinion about Emma's welfare. The conversation they needed to have with Emma about her grandmother's impending visit was even more delicate than explaining media attention had been. Emma had memories of Vivian from before Sarah's death, but they were the hazy recollections of a very young child mixed with the idealized stories Sarah had told about her own mother. "Grandma Vivian is coming to stay with us for a while," Christopher explained as they sat together on Emma's bed that evening, the 3 of them maintaining the united front that had become their default response to external challenges. "Is she nice?" Emma asked, her small face reflecting the uncertainty that came from meeting family members who were strangers. "She loved your mommy very much," Tamika replied diplomatically, her voice gentle despite what Christopher knew had to be internal turmoil about the upcoming disruption to their family dynamic. Sometimes when people are missing someone they love, it makes them sad in ways that can seem not nice, even when they don't mean to be. Emma nodded solemnly, her 6-year-old mind processing the complex emotional landscape adults inhabited when grief and love collided. Will she like our family the way it is now? The question cut straight to the heart of what they were all wondering, delivered with the kind of innocent directness that made adult complications seem suddenly transparent. We'll help her understand how happy we are together, Christopher said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. And we'll be patient while she learns to know us as we are now. Vivian Whitmore arrived that Saturday like an elegant hurricane, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite her obvious illness, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the penthouse that had once been her daughter's home and was now shared with a woman she clearly viewed as an interloper. At 73, even weakened by cancer, she possessed the kind of commanding presence that had made her a formidable force in New York society for decades. She embraced Emma with the desperate love of someone trying to memorize every detail of a precious grandchild. But her interactions with Tamika were icily polite in ways that created immediate tension. "Miss Wood," she said during their first dinner together, her tone carrying the kind of formal distance that managed to be both courteous and dismissive. "Christopher tells me you've been caring for Emma." "I have," Tamika replied, her own voice carefully professional despite the obvious slight. "Emma is a wonderful child. You should be very proud of the foundation Sarah built for her." It was a gracious response that acknowledged Sarah's role while establishing Tamika's own credentials, but Vivian's expression suggested she heard it as territorial marking rather than respectful recognition. The next few days established a routine that felt like walking through a minefield. Vivian spent her mornings with Emma, sharing stories about Sarah and teaching Emma family recipes that carried the weight of generational tradition. But she also made pointed comments about appropriate boundaries and temporary arrangements that left no doubt about her opinion of Tamika's place in their household. Christopher found himself caught between the two women he cared about most, his dying mother-in-law, who represented his daughter's connection to half her heritage, and the woman he loved, who'd brought their family back to life. Every interaction required diplomatic navigation. Every family meal became an exercise in maintaining peace, while emotions simmered beneath the surface. The breaking point came during Emma's bedtime routine, when Vivian walked into the little girl's room to find both Christopher and Tamika tucking her in together, the nightly ritual that had become one of their most precious family moments. "This is inappropriate," Vivian said, her voice sharp with the kind of authority that had once run charity boards and social committees. "Emma doesn't need multiple mother figures confusing her attachment patterns." "Emma needs the people who love her," Tamika replied, her professional demeanor finally cracking under the pressure of constant criticism. "And she's thrived with the care she's received." "Care that was supposed to be temporary," Vivian shot back, her grief and fear expressing themselves as protective aggression. "You were hired to help with childcare, not to replace my daughter and her family's affections." The accusation hit Tamika like a physical blow, confirming every fear she'd carried about her place in their lives. Christopher saw her face crumble for just a moment before she rebuilt her professional mask, but the damage was done. "I would never try to replace Sarah," Tamika said quietly, her dignity intact despite the obvious hurt. "I've only tried to love Emma the way every child deserves to be loved. By seducing her father and inserting yourself into a family that was functioning perfectly well without you?" Vivian's words were cruel with the precision that came from knowing exactly where to strike for maximum damage. "That's enough," Christopher said, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that had made corporate enemies retreat. "Vivian, I understand you're grieving, but I will not allow you to attack the woman I love in our home." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Christopher had experienced. Not a business negotiation or legal dispute, but a raw emotional battle between people who all claimed to love Emma most. Vivian accused him of dishonoring Sarah's memory, of exposing Emma to inappropriate relationships, of choosing lust over his daughter's well-being. Christopher defended their love with the fierce protectiveness of a man who'd finally found happiness and refused to apologize for it. But underneath his anger was the growing recognition that Vivian's criticisms were rooted in genuine love for Emma, even if they were expressed through the distorting lens of grief and fear. The fight ended with Vivian retreating to her room and Tamika disappearing to the kitchen, leaving Christopher alone with the recognition that his two worlds, past and present, grief and healing, Sarah's family and his new love, might be impossible to reconcile. That night, he found Tamika packing a suitcase with the careful efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since Vivian's arrival. "Don't," he said from the doorway, his voice carrying 3 months of love and desperation. "Please don't let her drive you away." "She's not driving me away," Tamika replied, her movements precise despite the tears streaming down her face. "She's loving Emma the only way she knows how, and maybe she's right. Maybe Emma doesn't need the complications I bring to her life." "Emma needs you," Christopher said fiercely, crossing the room to still her hands with his own. "I need you. We're a family, and families don't abandon each other when things get difficult." "Are we a family?" Tamika asked, her voice breaking on the question. "Or are we just 3 people who've been playing house until reality caught up with us?" The question hung between them like a chasm, forcing Christopher to confront the difference between the happiness they'd built in private and the legitimacy that came from public recognition and family acceptance. "Look at me," he said, framing her face with his hands and forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are Emma's mother in every way that matters. You are the woman I love. You are part of this family, and I will not let grief or fear or anyone else's narrow definition of appropriate destroy what we've built together." When she kissed him this time, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who might be saying goodbye, her tears mixing with his as they held each other against the possibility of loss that seemed to be stalking their happiness. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love Emma. I love our family. But I can't fight a ghost, Christopher. I can't compete with Sarah's memory when it's wrapped in Vivian's grief." "You're not competing with Sarah," Christopher replied, his voice rough with emotions he could barely contain. "You saved me from disappearing into that grief. You brought Emma back to life. You made us a family again." But even as he spoke the words, Christopher could see that Tamika had already begun the emotional process of leaving, protecting herself the only way she knew how, from the pain of being slowly pushed out of the family she'd helped to heal. The resolution of their crisis would come from an unexpected source, in a moment that would transform all of their understanding of love, loss, and the courage required to build families from the ruins of grief. As Christopher held the woman he loved while she prepared to leave him, he had no idea that Emma had been listening from the hallway, or that his 6-year-old daughter was about to teach all the adults in her life what it really meant to choose love over fear. The final battle for their family's survival was about to begin, and it would be fought not in courtrooms or media interviews, but in the heart of a little girl who understood better than any of them that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. The next morning, Christopher woke to the sound of quiet sobbing coming from Emma's room. He found his daughter, curled in her bed, clutching the family portrait she'd drawn weeks earlier, the one showing 3 figures holding hands in front of a house covered in flowers. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, settling on the edge of her bed with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Is Miss Tamika leaving?" Emma asked, her voice thick with tears and the kind of devastating clarity that came from children who understood adult emotions better than adults realized. "I heard you talking last night. She was crying, and you were asking her not to go." Christopher felt his heart crack as he realized that their attempts to shield Emma from adult complications had failed completely. She'd been absorbing every tension, every harsh word, every moment of conflict between the people she loved most. "Emma," he began, but she interrupted him with the kind of fierce determination that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "I don't want her to go," Emma said, sitting up in her bed with her small hands clenched into fists. "She makes us happy. She makes you smile like you used to smile with Mommy, She reads me stories and helps me make gardens and stays with me when I have scary dreams." "I know, baby," Christopher replied, his voice rough with emotions he could barely contain. "I don't want her to go either." "Then why is Grandma Vivian being mean to her?" Emma asked, her 6-year-old logic cutting straight through adult complications to the heart of the matter. "Doesn't she want us to be happy?" Before Christopher could answer, they heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by Vivian's voice calling for Emma to come have breakfast. Emma looked at her father with the kind of resolve that suggested she'd been thinking about this problem for longer than any child should have to. "I'm going to talk to Grandma Vivian," she announced, climbing out of bed with the determination of someone who'd made an important decision. "I'm going to tell her about our family." Christopher watched his daughter march toward the kitchen with the fearless confidence of someone who believed that truth and love were sufficient weapons against any adult complication. Part of him wanted to stop her, to protect her from the harsh realities of grief and prejudice and the ways that adults could hurt each other. But another part of him, the part that remembered Sarah's fierce loyalty to the people she loved, recognized that Emma had inherited more than just her mother's eyes. In the kitchen, Emma found Vivian sitting at the breakfast table, looking elegant and lonely in the morning light streaming through the windows. Tamika was at the stove making pancakes with the kind of careful efficiency that suggested she was trying to maintain normalcy despite the emotional chaos surrounding them. "Grandma Vivian," Emma said, climbing into the chair beside her grandmother, with the directness that had always characterized her approach to important conversations. "We need to talk." Vivian looked up from her coffee, surprise flickering across her features at Emma's serious tone. "Of course, darling. What would you like to talk about?" "About why you're being mean to Miss Tamika," Emma said, her small hands folded on the table in a gesture that somehow managed to be both childlike and dignified. "And about why you want her to go away." Vivian's composure slipped slightly, her careful social mask cracking in the face of her granddaughter's innocent directness. "Emma, sweetheart, it's complicated." "No, it's not," Emma interrupted with the kind of clarity that only children possessed. "You think Miss Tamika is trying to replace Mommy, but she's not. She's just loving us the way Mommy would want us to be loved." The words hung in the kitchen air like a revelation, cutting through weeks of adult conflict with the simple truth that had been obvious to a 6-year-old all along. Tamika's hand stilled on the pancake batter, her shoulders tensing as she waited for Vivian's response. "How do you know what Mommy would want?" Vivian asked, her voice gentler now, but still carrying the weight of grief that had been driving her protectiveness. Emma considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, her small face scrunched in concentration as she searched for words to explain something that felt obvious to her heart but complicated to express. "Because Mommy loved Daddy," she said finally, "and she loved me. And if she loved us, she wouldn't want us to be sad forever. She would want us to find someone who makes us happy again." The simple logic hit both adults like physical blows, mainly because it contained a truth they'd been too wrapped up in their own fears and grief to recognize. Sarah had loved her family with the kind of fierce devotion that would have made their continued happiness her highest priority, even if that happiness came through someone else's love. "Miss Tamika doesn't try to be Mommy," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her subject. "She tells me stories about Mommy and looks at pictures with me and says Mommy must have been very special to have such a wonderful little girl. She's not trying to make me forget Mommy. She's helping me remember her the right way." Vivian's carefully controlled composure finally cracked completely, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the wisdom of her granddaughter's words. "Oh, Emma," she whispered, reaching for the little girl with trembling hands. "And Daddy smiles now," Emma said, allowing herself to be pulled into her grandmother's embrace. "He laughs and plays games and isn't sad all the time. Miss Tamika fixed our family, Grandma Vivian. She made it so we could be happy again without forgetting how much we loved Mommy." Christopher appeared in the kitchen doorway just in time to hear his daughter's final argument, his chest tight with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. This was Sarah's legacy, he realized. Not just the memories they preserved, but the capacity for love and forgiveness and healing that she'd instilled in their daughter. Tamika had turned from the stove, her face streaked with tears as she watched Emma advocate for their family with the fearless love that had always characterized the little girl's approach to the world. "She's right," Vivian said finally, her voice thick with tears and the kind of recognition that came from being confronted with undeniable truth. "Sarah would want you to be happy. She would want Emma to have all the love possible in her life, even if it came from someone else." The admission seemed to break something loose in Vivian's chest. Grief that had been locked away behind protective anger finally finding its proper expression. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking at Tamika with eyes that held decades of social conditioning and maternal fear. "I was so afraid of losing Sarah completely that I couldn't see how much love you've brought to her family." Tamika moved toward the table with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded animal, her own tears falling freely as she recognized the shift in Vivian's demeanor. "I would never try to erase Sarah," she said softly, settling into the chair across from Emma and her grandmother. "Everything I know about being a mother to Emma comes from the foundation Sarah built. I'm just trying to build on what she started, not replace it." "I can see that now," Vivian replied, her voice carrying the weight of recognition and regret. "I can see how much Emma has flourished under your care, how much joy you've brought back to this house. I was so blinded by my own grief that I couldn't recognize the gift you've been to my family." Emma looked between the two most important women in her life, with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully solved a complicated adult problem through the simple application of truth and love. "So Miss Tamika can stay?" she asked, her voice carrying the hope of someone who'd been holding their breath, waiting for the adults to figure out what had been obvious to her all along. "Miss Tamika can stay," Vivian confirmed, reaching across the table to take Tamika's hand with the same gentle reverence she'd shown when first meeting her granddaughter. "And I'd like to get to know the woman who's loved my family so well." Christopher stepped fully into the kitchen, his heart full to bursting as he watched the three most important females in his life finally become the family Emma had always known they could be. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that had been building since the moment he'd first held Tamika in his arms, "I think it's time Miss Tamika became more than someone who stays. I think it's time she became family officially." The words hung in the kitchen air like a promise, and when Christopher dropped to one knee beside Tamika's chair, producing a ring box that had been burning a hole in his pocket for weeks, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Tamika Wood," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "you saved my life and Emma's life, and taught us both how to love again. Will you marry me? Will you be Emma's mother officially and my wife forever?" The proposal was everything their relationship had been: unconventional, honest, and witnessed by the family that had grown from the ashes of grief into something beautiful and unprecedented. "Yes," Tamika whispered, her voice breaking on the word as Christopher slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. "Yes to all of it. Yes to being Emma's mother. Yes to being your wife. Yes to this beautiful, complicated, perfect family we've built together." Emma's squeal of delight could probably be heard 3 floors down, but none of them cared about noise complaints when their daughter was dancing around the kitchen chanting, "We're getting married! We're getting married!" with the pure joy of someone whose deepest wish had just come true. Even Vivian was crying now, her tears mixing joy and grief and the kind of healing that came from recognizing that love didn't diminish when it was shared, but multiplied beyond measure. "Sarah would be so happy," she said, looking at the ring on Tamika's finger with wonder rather than the resentment Christopher had feared. "She would love knowing that Emma has 2 mothers who adore her, and that you found someone who makes you smile again." As they celebrated their engagement with pancakes that had gone slightly cold and coffee that had grown strong from neglect, Christopher realized that they'd finally achieved what he'd thought was impossible. A family that honored the past while embracing the future, that held space for grief and joy simultaneously. that proved love was expansive enough to include everyone willing to open their hearts. The war for their family's right to exist had been won, not through legal battles or media strategies, but through the simple courage of a 6-year-old girl who understood that love was meant to be shared, not hoarded, and that families were built through choice and commitment rather than just biology. 3 months later, they celebrated Emma's 7th birthday with the kind of party that had been impossible during the years of grief, full of laughter, friends, and the easy joy that came from a family that had learned to embrace happiness without guilt. Vivian, now living permanently in the guest suite and undergoing treatment that had given her more time than doctors had originally predicted, helped Emma blow out her candles while Tamika cut cake and Christopher took pictures that would join the collection of memories that proved their family's capacity for healing. "Make a wish, sunshine," Tamika said, using the nickname that had become as natural as breathing. Emma closed her eyes tight, her small face scrunched in concentration as she considered what more she could possibly wish for when she already had everything her heart had ever wanted. When she opened her eyes and blew out the candles in one breath, Emma looked around at the faces of everyone she loved. Her father, her soon-to-be stepmother, who felt like a real mother in every way that mattered. Her grandmother, who'd learned to love through grief rather than despite it, and knew that some wishes came true not because you asked for them, but because you were brave enough to accept them when they appeared. "What did you wish for?" Christopher asked, settling beside his daughter with the easy affection that had replaced the careful distance of their grieving years. "Nothing," Emma replied with the satisfied smile of someone whose life was exactly as it should be. "I already have everything I wanted. I have my family." And in that moment, surrounded by the people who'd fought to build something beautiful from the ruins of loss, Christopher understood that this was what victory looked like. Not the absence of challenge or pain, but the presence of love, strong enough to weather any storm, and generous enough to include everyone willing to be part of the family they'd created together. Their love story had been tested by corporate warfare, social prejudice, family grief, and the devastating power of loss itself. But it had survived because they'd learned the most important truth of all: that families weren't just born, but built, one choice at a time, by people brave enough to love without limits and fight for the happiness they'd found in each other's arms. As Emma ran off to play with her friends and Vivian settled into comfortable conversation with the other adults, Christopher pulled Tamika close and kissed her with the gratitude of a man who'd been given a second chance at everything that mattered. "No regrets?" he asked, looking into the eyes of the woman who'd saved his life in every way that counted. "Only one," Tamika replied, her smile carrying all the love and mischief that had made him fall for her in the first place. "What's that?" "That it took a fever and a thunderstorm and all that drama to get us here," she said, laughing at the memory of how complicated their path to happiness had been. "Next time, let's just skip straight to the happy ending." "Deal," Christopher agreed, pulling her closer as their daughter's laughter filled the air around them. "Though I have a feeling our happy ending is just the beginning of a whole new adventure." And as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the home they'd built together, Christopher knew he was ready for whatever adventures loving Tamika Wood would bring into his life. After all, they'd already survived the hardest part: learning to love again after loss, to build families from choice rather than chance, and to fight for happiness, even when the whole world seemed determined to tear it apart. Their story had started with a widowed billionaire who thought his heart had died with his wife, and ended with a man who understood that love wasn't finite, but infinite. Not something to be hoarded, but shared. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a celebration of what could still be found. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't defeating their enemies or overcoming obstacles, but learning that families could be built in infinite ways by people brave enough to love without limits and fight for the happiness they deserved. And that, Christopher thought, as he watched his wife-to-be laugh with his daughter and his former mother-in-law, was the kind of ending that made every battle worth fighting. And there you have it, my beautiful royal story family. A love story that reminds us that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but having the courage to build something new while honoring what came before. Christopher and Tamika's journey shows us that the strongest families aren't always born from blood, but forged through choice, commitment, and the willingness to fight for love, even when the whole world seems against you. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from opening our hearts wide enough to include everyone willing to love without conditions. Emma's wisdom taught all the adults in her life that families grow through addition, not subtraction, and that honoring the past doesn't mean sacrificing the future. I'm curious, beautiful souls, have you ever experienced that moment when love transforms not just your heart, but your entire understanding of what family can be? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences of finding love after loss, of building families through choice, of standing up for unconventional happiness. These stories inspire not just me, but our entire community. Whether you're navigating complicated family dynamics, healing from loss, or simply believing that love is worth fighting for, remember Christopher and Tamika's truth. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to love anyway. That families aren't just discovered, but deliberately built by people brave enough to choose each other again and again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to join our Royal Story family. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their happy ending might be disguised as a beginning, and that love has the power to resurrect even the most broken hearts. Until our next journey together, remember that you are worthy of a love story that honors your past while celebrating your future. You deserve a family that chooses you completely, and the courage to fight for the happiness that's waiting on the other side of fear. Sweet dreams, royal hearts, and thank you for letting me share this journey of healing, hope, and the transformative power of love that knows no boundaries.